Tonight on Discovering Women.
We can't afford that all of our research is devoted to the machine, because what we're trying to learn about isn't the machine that we're building, it's the brain.
The challenge, building a human brain on a computer chip. Tonight on Discovering Women. Discovering Women is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the contributions made by women in science. Additional funding is provided by the National Science Foundation, supporting education and research in science, mathematics, and technology, and by the Intel Foundation. Intel, maker of advanced computer chips.
The world is full of shapes and colors. All day long, our brain works like a computer, processing signals from the outside world into cars and people, buildings and trees. The brain helps us do things that the world's most powerful computer can't do. Recognize our friends, learn a language, or ride a bike. Misha Mahowald is an American living in Oxford, England. She's a computational neuroscientist, one of a new breed of young scientists trying to understand how the brain works.
Science is a fantastic thing because it lets you do experiments. It's the only human endeavor that's designed to take you places where no one has ever gone.
Being a pioneer in a new field is never easy. Misha has just come through a difficult year, but she stands today on the brink of a major breakthrough, which may change our understanding of how the brain sorts out the millions of images we see every day. This is the scientific journey of Misha Mahowald, a journey that began when she was a very small child, that began in the most unlikely of places, Disneyland.
There's a ride there where you are shrunk down to be very small, and you get to enter into water molecules which are bouncing all over the place.
The inner space explorers enter a giant microscope where ice molecules grow in size and electrons zip by until the pulsating nucleus of the atom is reached.
And I went on the ride, and I thought it was real. I mean, I was only 4 or 5 years old, but I believed it, and it didn't occur to me to ask anybody whether it was true because I'd seen it, so why ask? It must be so, and those things must be real, and the world suddenly was much more interesting than I had been led to believe, because there were all these things that were normally invisible to me that were really there, and I found that very exciting. Let's look at the channels now in a biological material and see if they have anything in common with the channels of our transistors. And if they do, maybe we can use the same tricks that biology has used to build these new silicon circuits.
In Mahowald's world today, machines may learn to see, to think, and one day to dream. 29 years old, she already has an international reputation. But her work is controversial, and sometimes she finds it hard to be taken seriously. Partly because she is so young, but also because she is a woman in a male-dominated field. I think that the biggest issue for me has been trying to present myself with authority. There's a saying that it's better to keep silent and let people think that you're a fool than it is to open your mouth and convince them of it. But what I find is if you keep silent as a woman, people assume that you're a fool. Whereas if you keep silent as a man, people assume that you're not. Or it could be that it's actually a little demon in the black box that's got...
I will go with her to a meeting. And although they have clear knowledge that she is completely influential in her own field, they will have difficulty making eye contact with her for the first 10 or 15 minutes, they'll speak to me, right? And very gradually, they'll begin to speak also with her.
A lot of the resources just devoted to controlling these guys. And that turns out to be a major problem when you're trying to build this kind of computer.
Mahowald is building a computer she believes will work like the neural networks of the brain. A computer that may be able to learn and to think as we do. She was in her early 20s when she first began working on this revolutionary computer as a student at the California Institute of Technology.
I was on a bus that drove by the driveway where they accept goods for the synchrotron. And I thought, people are really doing it. They're really going inside the atoms that I had seen when I was 5 years old at Disneyland.
Mahowald was an undergraduate student in biology. One day, on a whim, she signed up for a course entitled The Physics of Computation. The course was co-taught by engineer Carver Mead and biologist John Hopfield. Each student was required to complete an independent project. Mahowald went to Hopfield when she decided to build a working model of the retina.
The retina was not very similar to the kinds of neural networks he was familiar with, and I didn't get a lot of positive feedback from him, and I was ready to drop the course. But I knew the TA quite well, and he said, no, you mustn't drop the course. You're the only biologist in the course, and it's supposed to be a cooperative course between biology and physics. If you drop the course, this will be a joke. So he said, you must come and talk to Carver. Now, I hadn't understood a thing that Carver had said the whole term. I thought, no, this is pointless. But we sat down, and Carver was really interested. He really believed that sensory information was an important part of thinking. And so starting with the retina made a lot of sense to him.
She became a part of our research group even when she was still an undergraduate, and started making contributions right alongside the graduate students.
Misha's new mentor was a major figure in the computer world. He had helped revolutionize the silicon chip, the heart and soul of modern electronic appliances. In 1970, a chip the size of a fingernail could hold 100 components. By 1974, the number had soared to 10,000, and Mead said it could go much higher.
Then it was very clear that the problem wasn't even how to make them. The problem is, how would you design a thing that had 1 billion moving parts?
Mead's answer was an astonishing computer program that enabled engineers to create chips with millions of components. He now believed he had the computational power to build brain-like systems in silicon. Mead had been working with engineering students trying to build a retina without success. Mahowald's knowledge of biology brought new insights to Mead's team.
The retina was a project that was really well suited to the silicon that we had at hand, because the retina is a two-dimensional sheet of neural tissue, and what we have is a two-dimensional piece of silicon that we can pattern.
The retina is one of the outposts of the brain, a point where the brain encounters the outside world. The eye is often compared to a camera, but that analogy is misleading.
The job the visual system has is not transmitting an image from one place to another. It's to understand the image. So I see your face and I say, that's Jim. Well, how did that happen? That's a very complex thing, because in the beginning, it isn't even clear it's a face. It isn't clear what's out there, because there are trees and bushes and walls and all kinds of other objects. And how do you know what is an object and what belongs together? It's a very messy problem.
If Mead and Mahowald could build a retina on a silicon chip, it would be the first step in constructing a visual processing system. But from the first, it was a difficult struggle.
I didn't know the difference between what I didn't know and what was not known, period. And I think that's very common in students. They don't know because they're continually presented with stuff they don't know. The difference between them not knowing it and no one knowing it is not apparent at first.
And what often happens is people who are learning rapidly like good students, learn rapidly. And they're learning all these things they hadn't known before, and then they run into one that no one knows, and you don't learn it that rapidly. And that's often a big downer for students, and you went through some of that. When you get to the boundary of what's known, then it's much harder going, because it isn't a matter of looking up in a book or an article, it's a matter of figuring it out, and that takes much longer. This is a great example of one of those.
Over the next several years, Mead and Mahowald hit a number of dead ends, sometimes disagreeing on the right way to proceed. The conflict often reflected their different backgrounds. Mead was inclined to solve problems with engineering solutions. Mahowald was determined to follow the biological model of the retina.
When I started working with Carver, he was interested in doing motion detection with the retina. And motion detection happens at a later stage of processing in the retina than the part of the retina that I was interested in. And so for a while we worked at cross purposes because we were trying to make the structure that I had learned in my biology class and from reading the scientific literature perform a function that it wasn't really designed for, and it took us quite a while to sort out where we had gone wrong.
This is Misha Mahowald as seen by the device that she and Carver Mead finally built. The device begins processing vision in the same way as an animal's eye, passing light through a lens onto a retina, which in turn converts light into electrical signals. The retina, in this case, is a silicon chip. The silicon retina was a cover story in Scientific American, a remarkable accomplishment for a 27-year-old graduate student. But for Misha, it was only a first step. She wanted to learn more about the brain by following the visual pathway from the retina back into the brain's cortex, where images are processed.
If you have a visual image and you were able to study the way in which that image was transformed at different levels from the retina proceeding backwards into the brain, that it would be a powerful tool for understanding the way the brain works.
This is the stuff that is not completely obvious when I talk in a biological audience because...
To continue her work, Misha needed to get out of Carver Mead's engineering lab, into a lab dedicated to the study of the brain. That opportunity arose when she met Rodney Douglas, a visiting professor from Oxford, England.
She invited me to Carver's lab, where she and Carver had been working on the silicon retina, amongst other things. And so one day, I went there, and she began showing me the work that they had been doing. And within 20 minutes, I realized that I was looking at the kind of solution that I had always hoped for. That here was a way of doing things, of simulating the circuits of the brain, but the cortex in particular, in such a way that one would not only have the practical advantage of actually being able to see things that worked in real time, and you wouldn't be constrained by the problems you have with digital simulation, but at the end of the day you might actually have something that worked in the real world.
The idea of silicon neural networks was revolutionary, a way to solve a problem that had plagued science for years. When computers began to emerge in the 1940s, some scientists believed that it would be easy to design a computer program that mimicked the brain. After all, they argued, the brain works when nerve cells fire or don't fire, a simple on-off method, like the system of ones and zeros which drove their digital computers. But before a computer can recognize images, someone must carefully program it to turn those images into the abstract symbols of ones and zeros. Then it can be programmed to interpret the symbols, a process that is very exact but can also be very slow. We don't program our brains. Instead, the brain experiences physical objects from the real world. It sees an image or hears a noise and processes that experience immediately, without first converting the object into precise symbols. Mead and Mahowald's silicon retina works in this same direct way. It uses analog computing, a method that responds directly to physical experiences without first changing them into symbolic numbers. Analog computing is less precise than digital, but a lot faster. the artificial retina immediately responds to boundaries, for example, to distinguish Misha from the background in the twinkling of an eye. Mead and Mahowald believed that analog computing was a more accurate representation of how the brain functions. Rodney Douglas agreed. In 1992, Douglas invited Misha Mahowald to come to England and pursue postdoctoral studies at his lab at Oxford University.
Oxford seemed like it would open a whole new part of the world to me that I wouldn't necessarily have seen from the United States. The history of science in visual perception in Britain is quite notable, and I thought that it would be worthwhile to see how these people who had really founded the field saw things.
In England, Mahowald set a task for herself: to build a computer that could see, really see, able to distinguish the subtleties of shapes and sizes, just as we do throughout the day. The first step would be a silicon neuron which could further process the images captured by her artificial retina.
On the other ones, you have any two for £5. Here we are. And a free gift if you like, my darling. Do you want two for £5 and a free gift?
No.
Not at my flat. Hey? You like that? Guarantee you like that. You only want the one for £3, yeah? There we get it. £3 each. Oh, what a bargain here today, ladies. Turn off some cheap now. Yeah, a little bit of fresh beer for you, fellas. Let's do the sounding.
But as Misha settled into Oxford, she lost momentum. Far away from family and friends, her first winter in England was a lonely one.
The winter was very hard here. It was very gray, and the days were very short. And it's easy to sort of cocoon yourself up into a little space. And I didn't know very many people, so I couldn't go out and talk to my friends, really talk very much about what I was thinking about. It just stretched into this endless gray.
In the past, Misha often turned to painting as a way to handle her low periods. One of the paintings in her Oxford apartment was done during her Caltech years.
That painting I think of as being about creativity. I think of it as revealing hidden worlds that exist inside me. The darkness is where the potential is, and the lightness is where something specific has happened.
But this time, Misha's brushes remained packed away as she struggled with her new life.
I think that she has a responsibility. She understands the field well. She has a responsibility to act as a leader in that field. And I think that although she has had clear benefits from working with Carver, who I believe is an extremely influential and important person in this field, the downside of that is that it's very difficult then to take on the mantle yourself. And I think that this is the problem that she is experiencing at the moment.
But you see these ones coming out towards you?
Yeah.
Up or down? You've got to look at it horizontally. Turn the glasses back to front, all the way around. So you think that's amazing that your brain can do that? If you look at it here, you just don't see anything. It's all done up here.
What do you want? Are you going to have Darjeeling? If I made it sound? Okay.
Chocolate cake and Darjeeling, what a combination.
The new lab was a confusing place for Mahowald. During her years with Carver Mead, Misha was a biologist in an engineering lab. After moving to Oxford, she felt like an engineer surrounded by biologists, still an outsider.
The question is, why would anybody want to transplant a silicon retina into an animal?
Because they believe it, actually. Can we speak about why?
Yeah.
Because they believe that in the long term they're actually going to be able to get the silicon retina to couple up to some of the neural circuitry.
I think the better thing is to go and culture retina and just ask it to connect up.
I wonder whether that's not a better idea myself, but obviously...
If the objection is, well, we should culture retinas and use those prosthetically, you still have the problem of how are you going to get the nerves to generate. I'm hoping that we will come up with a set of experiments that wind up shedding light on how the brain really works based on our experiences in the silicon medium. This hasn't happened yet, and I think that it needs to happen before the biological community will look seriously enough at the silicon work to learn from it.
For much of the winter, Mahowald studied the biological data her co-workers generated, looking for a blueprint to build her first silicon neuron. She watched as biologists took apart the visual cortex from an animal's brain, slice by slice and then cell by cell, to see how it works. These studies extended the Nobel Prize-winning work begun in the 50s by David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel. Hubel and Wiesel had performed experiments with anesthetized animals and discovered by accident that each neuron responded not only to different shapes, but also different movements. Placing a probe near a brain cell of a cat, they expected to hear the soft explosions of a neuron firing as it responded to the image of a black dot.
And we found that the black dot seemed to be working in a way that at first we couldn't understand until we found that it was the process of slipping the piece of glass into the projector, which swept a line, a very faint, precise, narrow line across the retina. And every time we did that, we'd get a response. And even more than that, the line produced a response as it swept across the screen in one direction, but not in the reverse direction.
Different neurons respond to different shapes, movements, and colors. But how does each neuron know where to fit its bit of information into the total picture? No one knows for sure. That's the biological puzzle that drives Mahowald. What is known is that neurons communicate with each other, receiving information through these spidery arms called dendrites, and sending information out through the long, thin fiber known as the axon. But how that communication translates into thought, memory, and understanding remains a mystery. If Mahowald can build silicon neurons into silicon networks and get them to communicate with each other, she could build a model of the brain that might help science understand how this communication takes place in the visual cortex, and how that translates into the images we see. In May of 1993, 11 months after arriving in Oxford, Mahowald achieved her first major breakthrough. She completed the design for a silicon chip that would act like a single neuron in the brain's cortex. But until the chip was built, she couldn't be sure if it worked. The design was sent to a manufacturer. A month would pass before it would come back. Misha turned her attention to an upcoming trip to the United States. A meeting of computational neuroscientists was taking place in California, and Mahowald was to make an important presentation. She looked forward to the trip as a chance to see old friends. On the way, Misha planned to stop in Minneapolis to visit her family. She was especially eager to meet Samuel, the nephew born during her lonely winter in Oxford. Samuel's birth has been a reminder that an important part of her life is on hold.
I think having a family and having a child as a woman is one of the major transition points in life. And I find it difficult to know how to relate to myself almost. For whatever reasons, I think I always believed that having a child was almost the same as being a woman. And deciding not to have children or waiting for a long time to have children, I have mixed feelings about my own maturity in a way.
Misha grew up in this house in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her father, Al Mahowald, is a businessman. Her mother, Joan, chose to stay home and raise their 2 daughters.
I really would like to have her close by, but I realize she's got to use her talent, and she's got to go where she can do the research that she wants to do.
Misha was born in 1963 and adopted 2 weeks later by the Mahowalds, who named her Michelle.
Of course, Michelle is adopted, and when we found out we were going to get her, it was almost like going to the hospital, except we went to an office building, Catholic Charities, and received her there, and of course brought her home, and had all the relatives going to stop by and oogle and ogle, you know.
2 years later, the Mahowalds adopted a second daughter, Sheila.
This is Michelle. She would have been about 4 there. Sheila would have been about a little bit over 2.
I remember one Christmas I'd asked for a doll, and the appeal of the doll was that it was advertised, I think, on television as a doll that, a baby that had been left. And it was very satisfying. I found the baby, they gave it to me in a basket on the stairs. And I really felt like I could relate to the doll because I wanted to take care of it because nobody else was going to.
Happy to? Well, sure. Which way do you like them, this way? Okay, it's okay. All right. Whoops.
Don't lose the beat there.
When I first heard that my sister was going to have a baby, I think I was jealous. I think I thought, well, she's younger than me. You know, how can she have a family before me? But now that I've seen her with the baby, I find it easier to feel genuinely happy for her, and I can see that it's not where I belong just now. I think if I had been married when I was 19 or 20, I would have gotten a tremendous amount of satisfaction out of fulfilling the traditional roles that I had learned as a child. I think that if I marry now, my expectations will be quite different, and I'll be relating to a person as that person and not as somebody who fits into a slot or a role. I was in love when I was 19, and for whatever reason, and I've never been sure how I feel about this, I chose to invest myself more heavily in my studying and in my working than having a relationship was consistent with. I didn't put the energy into working out the problems that I had in the relationship. I put my energy into studying and let whatever problems there were build up. That wasn't a reasoned decision, that was just what happened, and I can't say whether it was good or bad.
Michelle began her education at St. Helena's Catholic School.
She was so interested in physical science. And of course, most of her questions were beyond my knowledge. So the science teacher and I would frequently go to the library and get books for her. And we would just give her books to read on the subject. And then another week later, another question would come up. And we go, okay, let's see what we can find out on this for you.
She could take a book and devour it in matters of minutes. You know, if you didn't know where she was in her bedroom reading a book. That's about where we could find her always. So she had a thirst for knowledge back then and really pursued it.
Michelle's interest in physical science grew out of her love of nature.
My favorite walk is by the river, the Mississippi River Valley. There are trails down there that stretch on for a long way, and you can walk for a long time and not see anybody. It has a timeless quality. The river flows by like it's been flowing forever, and it's easy to lose yourself. And when I went through high school, I took a lot of science classes and I took a lot of math classes. Math was fairly easy for me, so in 3 years, I had finished 5 years of mathematics at the high school level. And so my senior year, I went to the university to take another math class.
She took so many subjects, and she didn't care all that much about grades. So this is somebody who was literally trying to wring every last drop out of her high school education. She knew there were a lot of people in that building who had things they could teach her, and she had decided she was going to learn everything she could from all of them before she left.
And by the time I got to my senior year, I felt that I'd pretty much done what there was there to do. And I started looking forward to college as a way of doing a whole bunch of new things that I hadn't done before.
One of the hardest things we had to do was select a college for Michelle. She wanted to go out to California. That did bother me a little bit. I'm not a fan of the California lifestyle too much. As a mother, that bothered me. I knew it was a good place for her to go, technically.
I got on the airplane and sat next to a chap who must have been coming to Caltech because he had thick glasses on. He was carrying a copy of Scientific American. And I thought, oh no, they're all going to be like this. And we spoke on the way there, and he was very nerdly. He talked about mathematics and all the courses that he took. And he was only 16, and I was feeling already quite old, being almost 18. And I was quite trepidatious. And when I got there, somebody took me to the coffee house, and it was full of comic books. And there was scribbling all over the halls of one of the dorms done in fantastic colored marker. And I thought, this is where I belong. Because it wasn't about being a nerd. It was about being creative and about being who you were.
Mahowald now took her walks in the mountains above Caltech, and she changed her name from Michelle to Misha.
Misha was a name that I had used in high school, a pseudonym for notes that we used to leave in other people's lockers. Pranks we used to play were signed anonymously, and that was my anonymous pen name. And I decided that that was really how I would like to be known, because it's different.
Her school world had changed radically too. 85% of Caltech's undergraduates were men.
I really didn't know that I needed other women. And in fact, there was an attempt at the freshman orientation meeting that they hold on Catalina to encourage women to communicate with each other and to form groups. But it doesn't sound like a reasonable request when it's presented to you when you first get here, because what you really want to do is take part in the full Caltech community. You don't want to be limited to a category.
Mahowald majored in biology and threw herself into her classes. But she soon discovered that it took more than hard work to establish membership in the highly competitive Caltech community.
I wanted to prove that I had learned something by interacting with these people who would then be my peers, and what I found was that it was quite difficult to interact with them as peers. And in fact, it was almost as if we were playing some kind of game, like a basketball game. And when I got onto the court and got the ball, everybody stepped back from the basket, and I threw the basket, and the game went on as before, as if nothing had happened. And I found that extremely confusing. And there got to be a lot of tension building up, and I became very unhappy and left Caltech. I wasn't sure that I wanted to do science. I wasn't sure that I could do science.
The better the students, the more trepidation they have about how well they're doing. In fact, the very best students I've ever had have had, massive attacks of insecurity about whether they're really doing well enough, because they're acutely aware of all of the questions that haven't been answered.
When I did decide to come back to Caltech, it was largely because I had already started interacting with Carver very informally, and he encouraged me. And when I got back, he encouraged me further and really provided an avenue for me to express my creativity. And if I hadn't had that mentoring experience, I may well have left science.
When Misha returned to Caltech, she joined a group of women scientists who met weekly to offer each other mutual support. After her year in Oxford, Misha visited those same friends once again, enjoying the camaraderie she had missed so much in England.
And some of these require 2 applications.
Misha, I keep thinking of that.
Yard. Yeah.
Oh, very pretty.
Misha.
Oh, yeah.
That's perfect.
It is. That Samuel's?
Yeah.
It's
great.
But it's not tied.
The trees here aren't real great.
So it's kind of blurry because it wasn't tied. Developing a sense of your own authority in a mixed group is very difficult, because there's this sort of, I think, a cultural predisposition to give men authority. And if you're in a mixed group, you wind up having to fight that all the time. And then it becomes a dominant struggle, and that isn't what the group's about.
We all have the right credentials, probably you especially, Carlotta. You have, excuse me for using this word, but it's a great word, you have the right pedigree, and it was damn hard for you to get a job. We do all the things we're supposed to do, and we follow the path that the system says we're supposed to follow, and there are no guarantees for how it's going to be, out there and in the real world.
I never allowed myself to celebrate the papers getting published or the degrees that I got. I mean, when I got my BA, I said, well, that's nothing. I'm going to get a PhD. And when I got my PhD, I said, well, that's really nothing. I have to do a postdoc now. When I had done the postdoc and gotten the job, I said, well, that's nothing. I really have to, get tenure. And I never allowed myself to recognize or celebrate the things that I did, the milestones along the way.
The milestones in Mahowald's graduate years included work at the forefront of a major movement, the creation of a new Caltech department, computational neuroscience.
The students created the program in a very real sense. The students came to us sort of demanding a program that would allow them to study this area of science, or in a sense creating a discipline that involved a heavy emphasis on computation and theory, combined with a serious understanding of the way in which biological systems work. This is a new thing, and it is something that was largely driven by student interest. And Misha was certainly one of the very first students to push this.
Misha is, by her nature, rather cautious. So her taking on a whole new field and all was harder than for most students, just because she is emotionally, at heart, very cautious. It's been a tremendous act of faith on her part to go into a field which isn't fully formed yet and is just kind of coalescing out of the primordial ooze of academia.
Mahowald was working toward her PhD degree when she made a bold choice of a thesis project. She and Mead had successfully built their silicon retina, but biologically the retina represented only a small part of the visual system. Misha became interested in stereopsis, the ability of the brain to sense how far away an object is. If you look at your finger, first with the left eye and then with the right eye, the finger seems to be in two different places because each eye sees it from a slightly different point of view. By looking at that finger with both eyes, the brain locates exactly where it is.
Stereo is an interesting problem because it's something that happens in the brain. By the time you get into cortex, you see a lot of activity resulting from the cortex itself. The brain is imagination. And that was exciting to me. I wanted to start building a chip that could imagine something. And stereo is the first and simplest problem where it's very clear that something is being imagined.
Misha set up 2 silicon retinas to stare at an object. A third chip, the stereo chip, was to take information coming from both of the retina chips and, like the brain, compute where the object was. But that meant the chips had to talk to each other, and no one working in analog computing had ever made that happen. A friend suggested the problem could be solved by using a digital computing device.
When I first heard the idea, I was very resistant to it. I remember cursing and swearing at the dinner table and jumping up and down, shaking my head vigorously.
Misha rejected the idea because she believed a true model of the brain could only be done in analog. When she calmed down, she came to a startling realization. The brain itself used both systems. One part of the neuron, the dendrite, used analog processing, but the axon performed activities that resembled a digital system. Mahowald's ability to think as both a biologist and an engineer had given her the answer. She built a hybrid communication chip which took analog signals from both retinas, converted them to digital, and sent that data to the stereo chip. There, the digital signals were changed back into analog, so the stereo chip could locate the object in space. Graduation was approaching. As part of her thesis defense, Mahowald had to demonstrate her system at a public forum in the Beckman Institute. It meant moving a lot of delicate equipment into this auditorium.
There were 3 different video monitors that were used, one for each eye and one for the stereoscopic depth computation. Oscilloscopes, power supplies, voltage meters, 2 large tables full of equipment with blinking lights, and then the chips that I had built myself, which were by and large held together with wire tied in random places on the proto board and sort of loose ends hanging off every which direction. One of my retina chips was quite touchy. The design wasn't ideal, and if you apply the wrong voltages to the chip, it has a tendency to latch up, which means it gets very hot. Sometimes it melts. It's a bad thing. And these chips were so delicate that even though they had sent me 20-odd copies of the chip, I only had 2 left. And I needed 2 to do the demonstration because I was doing a binocular stereo demonstration. And I turned the power supply on, and there was a loose wire. Chip got really hot, and I thought, oh no, I've ruined it. This is the last chip, and it's never going to come alive again. But I took it out, let it cool down, put it back in, and it was fine. But it was the most harrowing moment. Your heart just pounds.
When she gave her thesis defense at Caltech, she filled the Beckman Institute. It was packed.
And it was like putting on a magic show, because I would say, and now we're going to see this, and I'd push the appropriate buttons, and that was what happened. It surprised me more than it surprised the audience, I'm sure.
And then she made the statement, this is not a simulation, this is real. Everyone that was in computer science that was on one half of the room just freaked. They just, sighed. They couldn't believe it. And they kept raising their hand and interrupting her, saying, it has to be a simulation. And then she'd show the visual thing, and it wasn't. It's alive, it's real. And it just blew them away. She just blew them away.
When you're struggling with your thesis, there are so many dimensions to the struggle, and you really take a lot of it on yourself. And even though people around you are being supportive, somehow the emotional impact didn't come through to me until I saw them in the audience, and I really felt like I was explaining to them what all that pain and anguish and struggle had been about, and that they could share in the celebration of completion with me.
They have met all the requirements for the doctorate at the California Institute of Technology. Mr. President, I present these candidates and those in absentia whose names appear in the program but will not be read, for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy.
Misha Mahowald.
The graduation ceremony ended with the announcement that Misha had won the award for Best Thesis in her graduating class.
I'd like to present you this check in recognition of this award now.
It's always extremely satisfying when someone that you have seen a lot of potential in actually realizes that potential. That's really the reason that those of us that teach do it.
Now, a year later, Mahowald is about to present an updated version of the communication chip from her thesis to other scientists who, like her, want to build models of the nervous system in silicon. All of the people in this room are working on different aspects of the brain. They're interested in the possibilities of their various projects coming together in a single system. To do that, their chips will have to talk to each other. Misha's communication chip could be key to the project.
You've got people who do work on DC motors and how you control those, the mechanical properties of heads and eyes, okay? And you have to knit all those things together. It's more integrated than, well, we have one student who's working on, vision, and another student who's working on color, and another student who does something with motor control.
The big problem is how can we have a decentralized project with different people who have different aims, some more engineering, some more biology-minded. How can we talk to each other so we have a final product which will actually talk to each other?
We can't afford that all of our research is devoted to the machine, because what we're trying to learn about isn't the machine that we're building, it's the brain.
The project under consideration is an active visual system, one that can act on what it sees. Such a system would have profound military and commercial applications. Weapons could select their targets. Robots could study distant planets. Cars could drive themselves. But that has never been Mahowald's goal.
I'm not really interested in product. I just want to understand what's happening. I hope that people will take what I do and make them products. If they make products out of what I do, it will give life to the work.
Science and engineering often have different goals. An engineer wants to build something that can be used, that can be marketed and sold, and perhaps even a profit made. Whereas a scientist is asking questions about nature, about how do things work. And the ultimate arbiter is experimental science. Whereas for an engineer, the ultimate arbiter is whether it works or whether it's commercially viable.
You've got a set of signals coming off the chip, which just from the point of view of that chip...
It's time for Misha to introduce her communication chip. The group expects her ideas to focus on analog technology, and some members are startled when she offers a device that includes digital signals.
I'm just talking about what kind of an infrastructure do you need to be able to do stuff in the analog chip that's worth doing in analog, and what stuff can you push off to something that's off the shelf.
So that means 2 out of every 3 chips are digital.
I'm not stepping that far away from the biology in the sense that I'm still doing analog electronic computation, and all the parts that need to be done quickly are still being done that way.
Well, you're using digital the way it should be used for communications. What's really nice is that you're going to create an environment that everybody can plug their central chip into, so that's what we all want.
If 2/3 of your board is digital, your team has become a digital design group.
No, it's not true.
No, it's a multidisciplinary team.
I understand.
And I think that we have to do that because we just can't grow those axons.
No matter what you do, okay, no matter what
For some, Misha's chip crosses the line. Once again, her work is met with suspicion. The meeting ends with no resolution.
Or there's a circle you didn't draw, but it's implicit, I guess.
But something has been resolved for Misha. She's realized that being both a biologist and an engineer have given her a valuable perspective her colleagues don't yet have.
I think that it's going to take a lot of effort to demonstrate that engineering can bring specific understandings to biological systems, and even perhaps even more work to demonstrate that understanding biological systems can give rise to new kinds of engineering solutions. But there's no proof like demonstration, the existence proof. So I just need to do it.
But can Misha make the neuron chip work? Back in Oxford, she's tense as she connects the silicon neuron to the silicon retina.
If we've characterized the retina properly, and we've characterized the cortical neurons properly, then hopefully when we put them together, we'll see the same kinds of outputs that we see when we provide visual stimulation to a whole animal.
If this silicon neuron works like its biological model, it will fire in response to a wave of Mahowald's hand. An audio monitor listens for the sound. Every day throughout the world, scientists struggle to alter and advance human knowledge. This morning, Misha Mahowald has succeeded.
Any fact in science can be reinterpreted. Any theory can be thrown out in favor of a new theory. It's not a building in the typical sense of the word, where if you took out the foundation stone, it would all crumble. It's more like a living thing, where every piece is replaced continuously, and yet the organism as a whole continues to be.
There are 100 billion neurons in the human brain. Misha Mahowald just built one of them. She has survived her first winter in Oxford, and she now looks forward to the work ahead.
Transitions in my life have gotten easier as I've had more practice at it, and I feel that I've started to understand the cycle of seasons. In the spring of a new idea and the enthusiasm for that idea, and the summer of work, the autumn of realization, and then the winter of fallowness, of mourning, of the passing of the old thing and waiting for the new thing to appear. and I now believe the spring will come again and the winter doesn't bother me so much.
A production of WGBH Boston. Next time on Discovering Women, unlocking the secrets of the human brain.
There are more cells in the brain than there are stars in the universe, so the complexity is staggering. And it is ultimately what makes us, us.
Discovering Women was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the contributions made by women in science. Additional funding was provided by the National Science Foundation, supporting education and research in science, mathematics, and technology. And by the Intel Foundation, Intel, maker of advanced computer chips. This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content.